See, I thought everybody was here for the lunch. What a great-looking crowd! This is terrific. I do have to acknowledge we have some special guests in the audience. It's not every day in Savannah I get to give a talk where my parents are here.
Yay!
So my parents are visiting. They came down from Kansas City for a few days, obviously for the new grandbaby. So they've got to get some time with the new granddaughter. It's really my pleasure to be here and to talk about, really one of my favorite things to talk about, which is about walking and living sort of a walking lifestyle. I do hope there's a couple of things that you take away from this. One is that walking itself is kind of a forgotten part of life that really is very healthy for us. And the second thing is that sort of living a lifestyle sort of centered around walking has a whole lot of other spin-off benefits, and I'm going to talk about that today. Now that I've said those two things, I don't want you to leave. So please stick around. I have some pictures and slides and things to show. So I love talking about walking, but I also love talking about food. And so I'm going to start by talking about food. I think one of the really the greatest things that has happened in the course of my lifetime is how people have become interested in real food again, and healthy food, and real ingredients. And it's interesting because it wasn't always this way. For a large part of the 20th century, the trend was towards sort of mass-produced food, industrial food. How many people in here had TV dinners? Okay, yeah, we all did that. And there's been this great revival of interest over the last 30 or 40 years in eating things that are actually come out of the ground again, and eating things the way that many of our grandparents used to cook and to eat. And in large part, that's because of the two women that are on the screen in front of me, who really, along with others, played a key role in changing people's thinking about food. Julia Child and Alice Waters, right? Alice Waters, who really helped create the organic food movement, starting in Berkeley, California, and then Julia Child, who really was very sort of terrified of what people were thinking about food, and that it shouldn't, that it was just fuel, and that it shouldn't be, fun or enjoyable. And so they really worked long and hard throughout the course of their lives to try to change the mindset and get people back to the notion of what it means to eat real food again. And Julia Child, who said this in 1990, long after her books about French cooking and her TV show, but she said, if the fear of food continues, it will be the death of gastronomy in the United States. Fortunately, the French don't suffer from the same hysteria we do. We should enjoy food and have fun. It is one of the simplest and nicest pleasures of life. And I think she's right about that. And I think many of us now really agree that food is not just something that we put in our bodies and we count calories, or it's just to fuel us till the next meal. It's something that we should enjoy, but also something that has a tremendous impact on our own health, that we are what we eat. And over the course of the last couple of decades, that's been reflected in a whole lot of different ways. We could show all sorts of charts and numbers, but I thought this one was really interesting, which just showed the growth of the number of farmers markets over about the last 20 years. It's amazing to think that just 20 years ago, there were only about 1,700 farmers markets in the entire United States. Okay, there are 19,000 municipalities in this country. So only about 10% of cities had an operating farmers market 20 years ago. And today, that number is actually over half. So it's a remarkable trend that's happened really in a fairly short period of time. Well, the same thing is really happening in a lot of ways at something that is also very simple and something that we used to do a whole lot of, and that's walking. And that's just the simple idea of walking from place to place. And obviously, we're lucky here in Savannah in that we have a beautiful city that is oriented around walking, or at least a portion of it is, right? Not the whole city is not this way, but certainly north of Victory Drive, we have a city where it's very easy and enjoyable to walk around in. And this has always interested me, when we talk about healthy living, I'm in a strange way, I'm not really the best person to talk about healthy living. I have bad habits like everybody else. I have a few extra pounds that I need to lose. I have some things I indulge in that I shouldn't indulge in. But one thing I do try to do is to walk a lot. I don't exercise or work out as much as I should. A lot of us have these things, but I do try to walk as much as I can as a part of my daily routine. And when we look at the various sort of health habits and how they affect your body, this is a chart that compares the daily caloric intake of Americans compared to other countries. And yet we're right there at the top, right? So we take in generally more calories than the average person in any other country. But the difference between us and sort of the next 5 or 6 is a magnitude of maybe 10 or 15%. So that's a lot, and it's important. We do overconsume, and we consume some high caloric foods that we shouldn't consume. But the difference is not dramatic. But when we look at how much we walk, it's dramatic. The average American walks about 5,000 steps a day. Now, 5,000 may sound like a lot, but it's about 2.5 miles a day. Most of the average Europeans walk about double of that. And we used to walk in that range as well. And obviously the reason we don't anymore is because we have reoriented our cities and our homes and our lifestyles to be around driving from destination to destination. And that has had a consequence. And that means we just generally don't walk as much in an informal way. You may drive somewhere, park, and walk to whatever you're doing, but most of us nowadays don't sort of walk to the grocery store, or walk to a corner store, or walk to a restaurant or anything else, or just walk to run errands in the neighborhood as many of our grandparents and their generation did. And the effect of that is that we have this number for us today, which shows that we just generally don't walk as much. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the health impacts of that later on. So, the French, for example, walk about twice as much as we do. Now, has anybody ever seen how the French eat? So, this is actually a McDonald's in France. This is how decadent it is to eat in France. And they tend to have a pretty high calorie diet, and they eat a lot of very rich foods. If you've experienced going to any kind of a French restaurant, or if you've been lucky enough to go to France, you see that for yourself, and they're not often small portions. But they do walk a lot. And there's a real difference of how that impacts the health of the average French person, because more of their lives are oriented around walking from place to place. And that's really what I've kind of been interested in exploring in most of my professional career, and that just really came out of a personal interest when I had the opportunity as a young person to travel and experience in different places. I just found that I really enjoyed those cities and towns where I could walk and I didn't need a car to get around. And that just kind of grew on itself over time with me to a place where I wanted to learn more about that and learn more about what we could do to make our own cities more conducive to walking. So as I said, obviously in Savannah we're blessed to have certain neighborhoods that are great for it. I did write this book about it a couple of years ago now. By the way, I do have like 2 copies. $10, it's cheaper than Amazon. So, and you can get it on Amazon and everything too. But I wanted to write, it's a very accessible book. I wanted to write this not for sort of planning and design professionals like myself, but really to describe from my own experience selfishly why living a lifestyle revolved around walking primarily instead of driving, why it's good for me, why I find that it's beneficial to me. And then you can judge for yourself if you like that or if you don't like that. It also has stories in there. I wanted to reach out to some other people I knew that live a similar lifestyle in different places all over the country. And so there are about a dozen other little stories and snippets in there from other people, and some of them are pictured on the screen, either friends or colleagues of mine that I thought would have an interesting contribution, all age ranges and all different parts of the country and everything else. And so really the focus of this book was to kind of talk about why, what's changing and why are things changing and what are those benefits. So if you think back to the time period when Julia Child and Alice Waters were talking about changing our attitudes about food, this is what a lot of our cities look like in that era. So this is actually Soho in New York City in the 1970s. Who's been to Soho in recent years? Yeah, it doesn't look anything like this anymore. We've seen a remarkable change in people's attitudes towards cities. This was Asheville, North Carolina in the 1980s. Most of these buildings at one point were slated to be torn down because people had sort of given up on the idea of cities and these sort of older places as enjoyable places to live or that they had any value. This was Savannah, obviously. This was Broad Street in the 1980s, really not that long ago. And it's been a remarkable change. This is an older shot, but this was Richmond, Virginia at one time. I think this is probably about the 1930s. Broad Street in Richmond, Virginia, that's Broad Street today. This is kind of what we've done, to a lot of our cities and our historic walking environments and walking communities. And what's happened over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, parallel to people's interest in thinking about food differently, has been an interest, once again, in these older cities and these older neighborhoods. And not just because the buildings, people find the buildings attractive, which they are oftentimes, but because it's a different lifestyle. And you have an opportunity, if you live in these historic neighborhoods, which were built around the idea of walking. Obviously 100 years ago, everybody basically walked. And very few people had cars yet. So most people lived a lifestyle around walking because you had to. So those old neighborhoods were built that way. Well, now we're seeing a resurgence in interest to people who are choosing that on purpose. You'll see a lot of stories these days about younger generation and the fact that they're driving a whole lot less, getting driver's licenses a whole lot less than any of their predecessors, and choosing to live a lifestyle that is a little bit different. But the trend has actually been going on now for about 30 years. If you go back to 1980, the preference for people who wanted to live in urban neighborhoods, which I would say is synonymous with a walkable neighborhood, for 25 to 34-year-olds was only about 10%. That gradually increased, and today it's a little over 50%. So we're really seeing now a lot of people sort of sort themselves into, do you want to live in a place where you can easily walk to different things and maybe live in a smaller place? You have that trade-off. Maybe you live somewhere smaller with a smaller lot and a smaller yard, but you have access to a lot of things that you can walk or ride a bike to. Or would you prefer a larger home, perhaps a larger lot, but the trade-off is you basically have to drive to everything. And we're kind of sorting now more or less into sort of a 50-50 in that split, which is far different than it was 30 or 40 years ago. So I wanted to then just sort of hit on, for those of us who've sort of chosen a lifestyle built more around walking, there's really a series of what I would call these sort of selfish benefits to doing so. And that's really what the book was about, and I'm just going to hit on a few of those today and talk about how they've impacted me and how I think they can impact you if you are interested. So related to the point that I made earlier about how we eat and our activity, this is actually a study that was done a few years ago that tracked the prevalence of obesity relative to what percentage of your trips were made by walking, biking, and taking public transportation. And in countries where people take more than half of their trips, or really even more than about 40% of your trips by walking or biking or public transportation, the rate of obesity is very low. and steady. And then obviously in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, where more people drive, and Canada to a degree, the obesity rates are quite a bit higher. And so we know that walking has all of these various health benefits. I have, pretty much every doctor I go to tells me to walk more instead of running, which, I used to run quite a bit. And they'll say, well, running is great. Any form of exercise, I'm all in favor of do whatever works for you. But there are certain forms that are much more high impact or put more stress on your body and your joints. And walking has that great sort of combination of you get a lot of health benefits from it, especially if you do it regularly, and it's very low impact. It doesn't really stress your joints out or your feet or anything else very much, or your heart. So there are tremendous benefits from it. There's a group called America Walks. They have a really fantastic website with a lot of good information about the benefits of walking and the various health benefits of walking. They put together this graphic here, which talks about all the different ways it can improve your blood pressure. It sort of reduces glaucoma risk. You burn more fat. There's obviously a lot of controversy about, is walking or running better for you? The reality is I think they're both good for you, but walking on a regular basis is certainly very, very good for all of your health systems. I think the other thing that it does is that the more you walk, the more it leads to other good habits. So you might walk more, and you might figure out, what, I might like to ride a bike and see what that's like. Because walking and biking actually go very hand in hand with each other. There's a quite famous former mayor of Bogota, Colombia, who said that biking is just a more efficient form of walking. And I really like that. I think he's very true in that regard. When you're at a destination, there is kind of a physical limit at which you're willing to walk. For most of us, more than about 10 or 15 minutes, which is about a half a mile or 3/4 of a mile, and it gets to a point, if you're a busy person, you don't want to walk much more than that. And that's where a bike can come in handy, because in a bike you can get a distance of a mile or 2 miles very, very quickly. And these habits really reinforce each other. And there's so much really about our health that is built around the habits that you create for yourself. And so, like I said, I have some bad habits. I like ice cream a little too much. I liked Dairy Queen since I was a little kid, and so I sneak off and make trips to Dairy Queen from time to time. So I have some bad habits. I like pizza way too much. I have some things that I shouldn't do, but I have gotten in that habit of walking on a fairly regular basis when my schedule permits me to do so. And if you can get to that point where you are walking 7, 8, 10,000 steps a day, it's really the cumulative impact of that over time. And I think probably Paula could speak to this, better than I could. But it's the habits that you create and how they reinforce themselves over time that really make a difference in your health. If you take up, walking a lot more this year, you may not notice a dramatic difference, in 6 months. You really may not. You may notice some improvement, but maybe there won't be. But over a period of time and many years, you absolutely will notice a difference. And it's the same way with eating healthy. When you change sort of your tastes and your habits about eating, it may not resonate immediately. But over a long period of time, you will see a direct impact in the tests for all the various health tests that you will undergo. There are some also, I can't help but resist this, there's some great sort of mental health aspects of walking that I just happen to enjoy. One of the things is when you walk a lot, you just experience the world very differently, and you experience it at a much slower pace. And so you notice a lot more things. And I feel like it gives you much more of an opportunity to sort of stop and smell the roses and see the little, beautiful details of life wherever they are. Ray Bradbury, many of you may know, was a famous science fiction writer. He wrote Fahrenheit 451 and a number of great books, but he also wrote a lot of short stories, and he wrote a lot about cities. And I really loved how he talked about cities and walking. This quote has always stuck with me, but he said, in Paris, with miserable weather, In thousands of outdoor drinking and eating places, the generations gather to talk and stare, which is what life is all about. Gathering and staring is one of the great pastimes in the countries of the world. And actually, I think we do that in Savannah very well. There's a lot of gathering and staring, right? And when you have a city that is built for that, built at that pace where you can do it, it has a lot of other sort of mental health spin-offs that I think are great. And I found this one in True Square. I really like that. I didn't do it, so not my artwork, but I thought it was very, very clever. So there's more in the book about some of the health benefits, some more detail on all that. You can certainly go, there's 100 websites you can look at for the benefits as well. I couldn't help but sort of quickly talk about two other areas that I mentioned in the book. One is the financial benefits that I'll hit on really quickly. So when I began to really research this a few years ago, the statistic just really jumped out at me that shocked me. That said, the average American family spends, in this chart, about 19% of their after-tax income on transportation. That's the average American household, 19%. That's 3 times what we spend on healthcare. 3 times. So think how much we agonize about healthcare costs, what your health insurance bill is, what your take-home bills might be from going to the doctor. How much discussion and debate there is always about healthcare. And we spend 3 times that amount on driving ourselves around. It's really a pretty shocking number. And if you can do nothing but live in a lifestyle where you don't need to drive as much, so what some of us call a car light. So, you know, most of us, it's not realistic to give up our cars completely. I think that's going to change with technology advances in the next 10 or 20 years, but most of us, that's not a realistic way to look at things today. But if you can just drive less, or if you're a household and you can eliminate a car, you can literally save thousands and thousands of dollars per year. The AAA estimates that it costs about $9,000 a year to own a mid-sized sedan. So even if you're at the low end of the average, and that's $4,000 or $5,000 a year, is there anybody in the room who wouldn't like to have $4,000 or $5,000 more a year in their pocket? It's remarkable. And then, again, it's the cumulative effects of that over time. So if you're always making a car payment, if you're always paying for those expenses, and how that sort of reinforces itself over time, if you can save some of that amount, you will find that it's an exponential benefit to your financial health. And obviously, if you are a middle class income or higher, maybe you put that money into a nicer house, maybe you put that money into savings or into a really nice vacation every year. If you're poor, if you're really in lower incomes, that's oftentimes that might be the difference between having a place that you can afford to live or not, and you know what kind of food you can put on the table. So it's really pretty remarkable. About 100 years ago, the average American household spent what? What percentage would you say they spent on transportation? Shout it. 1%? Very close. Basically 0.
Wow.
Basically 0. So what's happened over the course of 100 years is we've spent a lot more on transportation and on housing, and a lot less on food, for example. Food is cheaper, but we also, you know, eat lower quality food than we used to. So again, maybe you're not in a place in your life where you can eliminate driving, and I haven't. You know, I still own a car. My wife and I, we have cars, but we don't drive them very much. I think this year, this week I had to put gas in the car. I think that was probably the 5th tank of gas I put in the car this year. And that's because, you know, we walk or bike as much as we reasonably can, and that has a really nice benefit for our financial health. So, and obviously, if you're not driving very much, you're not really thinking very much about gas prices. So that's something else to kind of consider. There's this really funny guy kind of crazy guy who wrote a website, has a website. It's one of my new discoveries this year called Mr. Money Mustache. It's this crazy guy in Longmont, Colorado, and he writes all about different ways for people to sort of live a little more frugally, but he describes, so he lives in a more suburban environment, but rides a bicycle basically everywhere. And he describes the bicycle as a wealth-producing fountain of youth. So obviously wealth-producing meaning if you can learn to get comfortable riding a bicycle to a lot of your destinations, you're saving a whole lot of money that you would spend on a car or gas. And then it has the wonderful side effect that it's very, very healthy for you. And so it has tremendous benefits in that direction. Now, not every place is set up well for walking and biking, and this is something that we struggle with, and every city struggles with. We have a lot of places that look like this, or like this, where it's very, very difficult to integrate walking or riding a bike into your lifestyle. And those are things that we need to work on. And I'm convinced that we can make improvements everywhere, really, in any neighborhood. This is something that for us all to sort of think about. So lastly, there is also a series of sort of social benefits to walking. This one is very simple, but another one of my occasional bad habits. I do enjoy having a beer or two, not only do I maybe get to walk off that beer, so if I convince myself if I walk about half a mile or so that I could probably burn enough calories to have a beer, and that's okay. But even more so, if you live in a place where if you build your life around walking, you never have to worry about drinking and driving, and that's a big deal. That's a really big deal. And so obviously there are a lot of new transportation technology out there that can help with all this, but it's a much easier thing to incorporate in your life than if you live a lifestyle where you live in a more remote location, and no matter what the case is, you're going to have to drive. So that impacts your social life in a whole lot of ways, but in a city like Savannah, it's very important. So let's just leave it at that. The other thing I would add is, there's an interesting thing that happens when you live your life at a pace where you're just kind of walking around and engaging with other people. And when I'm moving around at this speed, not only do I see things, but I see people differently. And you tend to approach and react to people differently. So when I'm driving, that's a pretty good image of what I look like when I'm driving. Really, and unfortunately, I think a lot of us are this way. I'm not a very nice person when I'm driving, and we all have, we are kind of insulated in your little bubble. So other human beings, you just see differently. They're your competition for road space or speed or whatever else. But when you're walking around, you tend to have these kind of interactions. And you tend to see people with a smile on your face, much more so than anything else. And this kind of atmosphere is much more conducive to getting to know your neighbors, to getting to know people informally who you see all the time. And it really reinforces itself in a very nice way. And I'm convinced it helps build community as well, because you engage people as human beings face to face. All right, so just finally, when I wrote the book, I felt like I had to end it in a way to say, okay, well, what do we do? What do I do if somebody says this is great? What can I do? I think the easiest thing is, like anything, is just to get started. I know there are walking groups around town. The easiest thing, even if you live in a place that is still more suburban in orientation, you can get out and walk around. There's nothing that prevents you from getting out tomorrow and going and walking a couple of miles and just build that habit up. There's probably a store or something within a couple of miles that you could walk to, maybe a coffee shop, maybe a convenience store, and just sort of build up a habit of finding places that you can, finding ways to integrate walking into your life. And then also, find a bike. getting a bike is one of the cheapest things that you can do. You can probably find a bike on Craigslist for $50, any day of the week. You can go to Walmart. I think you can get a cruiser bike for about $75. They're pretty cheap.
Shop local.
Shop local as well. Yes, there are plenty of good local bike shops. And then I think it's important to, in trying to build any good habit, to just be encouraging of other people, and especially children and young people, to try to build those good habits. Yes, you can move. It's possible. A lot of us don't think about that, but it's easier to move than you might realize. If you live in a place where you're not able to walk a lot now, but you would like to, look around. There are maybe more options than you realize. And then the last one really is, if you would like to find ways to improve your own neighborhood, your own community, to have more of this in your community, to have better sidewalks, to have better access to things that you can walk to. If you'd like to have an ice cream shop you can walk to. Get involved and make your own voice heard. There are lots of opportunities. There are great groups here like Healthy Savannah that really work on being active and advocating for these issues. And the only way that those changes ever happen is by people like yourselves getting involved and really making sure that they happen. So that's all I have for today. I do appreciate everybody's attention and interest. Thank you very much.
So, Kevin, we have time for a couple, 3 questions.